The desert doesn't give you second chances. You get what you take, and you take what you can. And when something unexpected shows up, you better be ready for it, because out here, nothing ever stays the same for long. Cole Whitaker had never been the kind of man to expect much from the land. It had a way of taking what it wanted, leaving behind only dust, bones, and the faint echo of better days. Ever since his father had died and left him with the land and the failing ranch, Cole had learned to survive the only way he knew how: quietly, alone, and with a steady hand. In the mornings, when the sun had just begun to rise over the horizon, he'd fix the pump, mend the fences, and pray for rain, even though he knew it wouldn't come. Cotton Creek Ranch, like most of New Mexico, was a place forgotten by time, where the wind carried whispers of past generations and the promise of a future that was just out of reach. This morning, however, something was different. It wasn't just the dry heat or the broken pump. It wasn't just the cracked earth beneath his boots or the silence that always hung in the air. No, today something had shifted, and it was only a matter of time before Cole would be forced to face it. It started with a sound. A faint, unfamiliar clop of hooves on gravel. At first, Cole thought it was just his imagination, a trick of the desert wind. But as the sound grew louder, closer, he reached for his rifle instinctively, just in case. Out here, strangers didn't always come in peace. He scanned the horizon, his eyes squinting against the harsh light of the rising sun. Nothing but the familiar stretch of empty land. But then, over the rise of the trail, he saw her. A figure, small, almost lost against the vastness of the landscape, riding a sway-backed donkey. The girl, or woman, was barely visible through the shimmer of heat rising from the ground, but Cole could see enough to know she wasn't from around here. Her wide-brimmed hat shielded most of her face, but the air around her seemed to tremble with the weight of something he couldn't quite place. For a moment, he considered the possibility that she might be a mirage, the desert playing its usual tricks. But then the donkey's hooves hit the gravel again, and Cole's instincts kicked in. His hand tightened around the rifle's grip. You could never be too careful. As she came closer, Cole noted the dry dust clinging to her clothes, the way she sat on the donkey with a quiet assurance, her posture straight and unyielding. When she dismounted, her feet touched the ground with a soft, purposeful thud. Bare, just like the rest of her. She didn't look nervous. She didn't seem afraid. In fact, she looked as if she had every right to be here, as if this desert, this place of endless struggle and burning sun, had already claimed her as its own. The way she carried herself, the way her gaze never wavered, told Cole that she wasn't a stranger in the same way others were. She belonged here. Or at least she had learned to survive here. She didn't wave, didn't smile, just nodded once in his direction. "Morning," she said, her voice clear and confident, though the dry wind carried a weariness in it. "I came for water," she added, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. Cole blinked. Water. He'd had visitors in the past, but none had ever arrived so directly, so uninviting. Most folks came hesitant, afraid to ask, offering something in exchange: eggs, firewood, gossip. But this girl, this Apache woman, didn't need to ask. She simply came, as though the land owed her something. And perhaps it did. "You figured right," he said, his voice hoarse with the dust of the day. He motioned to the trough, still half full from the last rainstorm. What little there was. Her eyes flicked to the trough, and without another word, she went to work, steadying the jugs under the waterspout with practiced hands. Her movements were deliberate, graceful in a way that spoke of a life lived in tune with the land, in harmony with its unforgiving rhythms. Cole leaned against the corral post, still unsure of what to make of this encounter. She didn't seem to notice his gaze, too focused on filling the jugs. When she was done, she lifted them, one by one, each filled to the brim, as if the weight of the water didn't matter. "You came all the way out here alone?" Cole asked, finally breaking the silence. She didn't hesitate. "No one else had the legs for it," she replied matter-of-factly. Cole frowned. "It's dangerous out here. There have been bandits spotted east of the ridge." She didn't flinch. In fact, she even lifted the hem of her dress slightly to reveal a small carved handle tucked into her belt. A knife. "I know where to cut," she said, her tone as steady as the ground beneath them. Cole let out a half laugh, despite himself. "You're not afraid of the desert." She turned to him then, her dark eyes locking with his in a way that made him feel like she could see right through him. It was unsettling. "That makes me more afraid of you," she said, the words slow, deliberate, like she was planting them into the earth to grow. It was true. There was something about her that rattled the stillness inside Cole, something that felt too alive for this barren place. She wasn't just thirsty for water. She was searching for something more, something that he couldn't name. "Thanks for the water," she said, securing the jugs back onto her donkey's side with the same calm precision. "I'll be back tomorrow, if that's all right." Cole watched her for a moment longer than he meant to, feeling a strange tug in his chest. He nodded, unable to stop himself. "It is," he said, his voice tight. She turned without another word, and just like that, she was gone, disappearing over the ridge like a ghost caught in the heat waves, leaving Cole standing alone on the dusty earth, the stillness returning to the land. But it was different now. The silence was no longer just the absence of sound. It was heavy, filled with the weight of something unspoken. And for the first time in a long while, Cole Whitaker realized that the land wasn't the only thing he was fighting to keep alive. Something inside him had just awakened, and it was just a matter of time before he'd have to face it. The days after Rosalie's first visit to Cotton Creek seemed to stretch and bend like the desert heat. Each moment pulled a little longer than the last. She kept coming back, the same quiet determination in her stride, her eyes never straying far from the work at hand. Cole couldn't help but notice how she carried herself, how every movement seemed deliberate, measured, as if she had known from the start that this land didn't give you anything for free. And unlike most, she didn't ask for anything either. She didn't speak much, didn't offer stories of the past or of what had led her to this point. She didn't need to. There was a strength about her, something that radiated from deep inside. Her silence, the steady rhythm of her work, spoke volumes. It wasn't just the silence of someone who didn't know what to say. It was the silence of someone who didn't need to say anything. Every morning she showed up, sometimes earlier than Cole, and sometimes after the sun had already begun its climb across the sky. But no matter the time, she always arrived ready. Cole watched her from the porch on those mornings, watching how she carried the jugs, her feet bare on the dry earth, her long black braid swinging with every step. The wind caught her hair and tossed it around her face. But she didn't flinch. She just kept moving, steady as the sun, walking out to the trough with purpose. He had seen enough people come and go in his years out here to know the difference between someone who was just passing through and someone who belonged to the land. Rosalie, in her quiet way, was the latter. She would fill the jugs without saying a word, working with the rhythm of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. And with each visit, Cole found himself drawn to her more and more. There was something about the way she moved, graceful but powerful, like the land itself. There was no hesitation in her actions, no uncertainty, She knew exactly what she was doing, and it made Cole feel like an outsider in his own home. One morning, as the sun was still low and the air had a coolness to it, Cole found himself already out by the pump, waiting. He wasn't sure what he was waiting for, but there was something inside him that felt like it was uncoiling. He couldn't explain it, but he knew Rosalie had something to do with it. When he heard the faint sound of hooves again, his chest tightened just a little. She was coming, just like she always did. And this time, he didn't feel like he was just watching a stranger. He felt like he was waiting for something else. Something bigger. Rosalie didn't waste any time. She arrived, her donkey's hooves dragging on the dusty ground, and without a word, she dismounted, tying the animal to the post near the trough. She wasn't here to make small talk or ask for help. She was here to do what needed to be done. Cole watched her as she worked, her focus absolute, her hands steady as she filled the jugs with water, careful not to spill a drop. After a moment, Cole spoke. "You don't ask for help much, do you?" he asked, the words coming out before he could stop them. Rosalie glanced up at him, her eyes dark and intense, but not angry, just curious. "What would I need help with?" she asked, her voice calm but with an edge, as if she had long ago figured out that asking for help was a luxury she couldn't afford. Cole wasn't sure what to say to that. It struck him more deeply than he cared to admit. He had spent so much of his life working alone, relying only on himself. He didn't have the luxury of asking for help either, but he had never thought about it the way Rosalie put it. She wasn't just surviving out here. She was thriving, on her terms, without asking anyone for anything. "You've been coming out here every day," he said, his voice softer now, more thoughtful. "What keeps you coming back?" Rosalie didn't answer immediately. She kept working, tightening the rope around one of the jugs. When she finally spoke, her words were low, almost to herself. "I don't have anywhere else to be," she said simply. "I came out here because there's work to do. The land doesn't care about your story, Cole. It doesn't care if you're tired or if you've had enough. It just keeps pushing you until you either push back or you break." Cole stood silent for a moment, trying to process what she had said. The land had a way of pushing people to their limits, that much he knew. It hadn't been kind to him, or his father, and yet here Rosalie was, taking it all in stride. For the next several days, Rosalie continued to show up, and each time, Cole found himself paying more attention to her than he should. He would watch from the porch or the pump, observing how she worked without asking for anything in return. It wasn't just the strength in her body that fascinated him. It was the quiet fire in her eyes. The kind of fire that came from years of surviving a life most people couldn't even begin to understand. He knew it was a kind of strength he could never truly grasp, but he couldn't help but admire it. One afternoon, after hours of working in the heat, Rosalie sat on a rock near the barn, wiping the sweat from her brow. Cole had been fixing the fence, and as he worked, he couldn't help but glance over at her from time to time. Her hair had come undone, and a few strands stuck to her forehead. She looked tired, but not broken. She looked like someone who had been through more than she ever let on, but still carried on. "Where are you from?" Cole asked, his voice quieter than usual. Rosalie didn't answer immediately. She seemed to consider the question, but then, in her own time, she finally spoke. "Does it matter?" Cole was taken aback. He wasn't sure why he had asked. Maybe he wanted to know something more about her, something beyond the surface. But there was something about her that made him feel like he didn't have the right to know. Like the desert itself, she was a mystery, untouchable, unknowable. "It matters to me," he said, his voice rough. She looked at him, her gaze steady. "I'm Apache," she said simply. "Born and raised in the desert, same as the land, My father's a blacksmith in Las Palomas. We don't have much, but we make do." She paused for a moment and then added, "What about you? What's your story?" For a moment, Cole didn't know how to answer. He had his reasons for being here, just like Rosalie, but he had never stopped long enough to think about them. The land had taken so much from him, but it had also given him something that kept him going when he wanted to quit. But when he looked at Rosalie, sitting there with the desert stretched out behind her, he realized just how little he had really thought about it. "I'm just a man trying to hold on," he said finally. She nodded, like she understood that too. Then she stood up, stretched her back, and grabbed the rope to secure the donkeys. "Well, Cole," she said, looking at him one last time, "if you're holding on, then we'll see how long that lasts." Without waiting for him to reply, she turned and walked off, her silhouette framed against the burning horizon, leaving him standing there, wondering if she was right. Cole watched her leave, the heat of the day wrapping around him like a thick blanket. He wasn't sure where their journey would lead, or even if he wanted it to go anywhere. But one thing was certain. Rosalie Jimenez wasn't like the other people he had met out here. She was different, and maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what he needed. The days wore on, each one blending into the next like the endless stretch of dirt and sky. But something had shifted. Rosalie and Cole, once two strangers thrown together by necessity, had begun to find a rhythm in their work. The days of terse exchanges and simple nods had long passed. Now they worked side by side, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. It wasn't the kind of partnership where words were wasted. In fact, the less said, the better. There was a quiet understanding between them, an unspoken bond forged through labor, sweat, and the unyielding heat of the desert. The mornings were cooler, the evenings colder, but in the midday sun, the air burned like the surface of a metal stove. And yet they kept working, fixing fences, mending roofs, and hauling water. Every day, Cole found himself watching Rosalie more. She moved differently from the other women he'd known, with a grace born not from fragility, but from sheer strength. She wasn't afraid of the work or the land. It was as if she had been made for this life. When they worked together, she didn't speak much about her past, but the way she carried herself told him everything he needed to know. She didn't need sympathy. She didn't want to be saved. She had her own survival to worry about. Rosalie had long ago made peace with the land, and in that peace, there was an intensity that Cole had never truly understood until now. He noticed it most when they worked with the tools. She held the hammer like it was an extension of herself, her hands firm, steady, every strike purposeful. The nails went in without hesitation, straight and true, like she knew exactly where they needed to go. Cole had never been one to shy away from hard work, but there was something about the way she wielded those tools that made him realize just how little he had truly understood about the land and his place in it. It wasn't just about fixing what was broken. It was about understanding the land, respecting it, and working with it. "Here," she said one afternoon, as they stood by the barn, the heat of the sun pressing down on them both. "You're gripping the hammer too tight." Cole looked down at his hands, which were already beginning to blister from the rough work. He hadn't noticed. His hands had always been like that. Strong, sure, but always a little too rough, a little too impatient. Rosalie stepped closer and gently took the hammer from his grip, placing it in his hand with a quiet command. "Relax," she said softly, her voice calm. "The hammer doesn't do the work. You just guide it." She stood behind him then, her presence steady and sure, her hands brushing against his as she adjusted his grip. For a moment, Cole felt something shift. Something that wasn't just physical. The warmth of her touch, the way she stood so close, grounded him. He had always thought of himself as a man who had to do everything alone. But Rosalie wasn't asking him to depend on her. She was showing him how to depend on himself, in a way he hadn't known he could. "Let it fall," she murmured, her voice low, close to his ear. "Don't force it. Just let the tool do its job." Cole nodded, and this time when he struck the nail, it went in straight. It was smooth. And something in him, something he hadn't realized he was missing, shifted. The land didn't just want him to fix it, it wanted him to learn from it, to listen to it. And Rosalie, with her quiet strength, had given him the key to understanding it. As the days passed, their work together became more than just fixing fences and mending roofs. It became a way of seeing the world differently. Rosalie didn't speak much about her past, but the way she worked told Cole everything he needed to know. She had come from a world of loss, of hardship, of people who had been forced to survive at any cost. But she had never let it break her. If anything, it had forged her into something stronger than the land itself. They didn't need to talk about it. It was there, between the hammer strikes and the clinking of tools, in the way their movements had synchronized without them even realizing it. There were no grand confessions, no declarations of love or need. There was just the work, the unspoken language of two people who had learned to survive, side by side, on a land that had no mercy for weakness. One evening, after a long day of work, Rosalie sat on the porch, wiping the sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the land. She didn't say anything, but Cole could see the weight in her eyes, the quiet strength that was always there, hidden just beneath the surface. "You ever wonder if it's worth it?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. The question had been sitting in his chest for days, and for the first time, he felt like he needed to ask it. Rosalie looked up at him, her eyes steady. "Worth what?" "Worth all the work, all the struggle, the fighting, the surviving. Sometimes it feels like nothing changes, no matter how hard you try." For a long moment, Rosalie didn't answer. She just stared out at the horizon, her gaze distant. Finally, she spoke, her voice low but full of conviction. "You don't get to decide what's worth it, Cole. You just keep going. The land doesn't care if you give up or keep fighting. It just keeps moving forward. You can either keep up or get left behind." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He had been so focused on the fight, the struggle to hold on to something, anything, that he had forgotten the one thing that really mattered: moving forward. Rosalie didn't need to justify her choices or explain her purpose. She just did what needed to be done every single day, and that, he realized, was all that mattered. They spent the rest of the evening in silence, sitting side by side, the desert wind brushing against their skin. There was no need for more words. The land had already spoken, and Rosalie had taught him how to listen. As the night grew colder, Cole glanced over at her, watching the way her face softened in the fading light. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. And that, more than anything, was worth everything. The afternoon was long, the sun hanging heavy in the sky like a stubborn stranger refusing to leave. The day had been quiet until the sound of hooves broke the silence. Cole had been working on the fence line, the rhythmic thud of his hammer the only noise as he pounded nails into the wooden posts. He had grown used to the stillness of the land, the kind of silence that filled the gaps between thoughts, but now it was broken by something else. The steady clip-clop of hooves told him someone was coming. He stood still for a moment, wiping the sweat from his brow, and listened. It was Domingo. Cole had seen him around town, always the quiet blacksmith, with the limp from an old wound and the sharp eyes that never missed a thing. Domingo didn't ride into town unless it was important, and the way the sound of his horse's hooves echoed in the distance told Cole this wasn't going to be a friendly visit. Rosalie hadn't mentioned anything about her father coming by. But then again, she rarely spoke of her past or the people who came from it. All Cole knew was that Domingo had raised a daughter who didn't take kindly to anyone telling her what to do. And the more Cole saw of Rosalie, the more he understood why. She wasn't just a woman from the land. She was someone who had been shaped by it, hardened by its cruelty, yet softened by the tenderness only the desert could offer. Cole turned toward the approaching sound, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle leaning against the fence post. He didn't need to reach for it. There wasn't going to be any trouble. Domingo was a man of few words, but when he spoke, you listened. Domingo's horse crested the hill and appeared on the horizon. The man was silhouetted against the golden sky, tall and solid, like the desert itself. He rode slowly, his mare's hooves dragging through the dirt with the kind of weight that seemed to carry years of history. Domingo didn't wave, didn't smile. He just looked at Cole, his eyes dark and unreadable under the brim of his hat. When he finally reached the fence where Cole was standing, Domingo dismounted with a grunt. He didn't say hello, didn't offer pleasantries. His presence was enough. "Cole." Domingo's voice was rough, like the land itself. "We need to talk." There wasn't a hint of politeness, just an edge of authority that made Cole straighten up, his hand still resting on the rifle. "What about?" Domingo didn't waste time. "Rosalie's been coming here a lot, working with you." His eyes locked onto Cole's with an intensity that made the air between them grow thick. "I've seen it." Cole didn't speak at first. He wasn't sure what to say. He had worked with Rosalie. He hadn't kept it a secret, but he hadn't exactly told anyone either. There was nothing between them. Not yet. But Domingo's gaze told him that the man knew more than he let on. "I don't mind her working," Cole said, his voice steady. "She's good at it. Better than most." "Better than most," Domingo repeated, his voice laced with a hard edge, as if questioning whether Cole really understood what he was saying. "She's more than that. She's my daughter, and she's not a child anymore. Don't mistake her strength for weakness." Cole's stomach tightened. The weight of the old man's words settled over him like the heat of the afternoon sun. He had always known Rosalie was strong, but hearing it like that, seeing the way Domingo said it, as if it were a warning, made him realize just how much he still didn't understand about the woman who had been working beside him for weeks. "I don't mean any disrespect," Cole said. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they didn't quite cover the weight behind them. Domingo took a step closer, the creak of his boots the only sound as the dust swirled around them. His eyes were hard now, focused on Cole like the iron he hammered into shape every day. "You may not mean disrespect, but it's there. Rosalie doesn't need your protection, Cole. She doesn't need anyone to hold her hand, and she doesn't need anyone to tell her what she can and can't do. She's had to survive on her own for a long time. You don't get to decide what she's worth." Cole swallowed hard, his throat dry from the tension in the air. He'd spent his life doing what he could to hold on to something, his ranch, his family's name, the land. But Rosalie wasn't like him. She had learned to survive in a way he hadn't. He respected that, but part of him felt like he didn't know how to handle it. He had been raised to protect women, to take care of them, to make sure they were safe. But Rosalie didn't need that. She never had. "If you can't help her build a future," Domingo's voice was quiet now, but sharp as a knife, "then you need to let her go. She doesn't need you for charity or pity. She needs you to be honest with her. And with yourself." Domingo paused for a moment, his gaze still fixed on Cole. "She came to this ranch because she saw something in you. I'm not sure what that is yet, but if you don't figure it out, I'll make sure she moves on. She doesn't belong here if she doesn't belong with you." With that, Domingo turned his back to Cole and began to walk toward his horse. The words hung in the air like a challenge that Cole couldn't shake off. He wanted to shout something, anything, but he didn't. Domingo didn't need an answer. He wasn't looking for excuses. "Make sure you're honest with her," Domingo called back over his shoulder. "She's already seen the truth. If you're hiding something, she'll find out." With that, the old man mounted his horse, his movements deliberate and slow. He didn't turn back as he rode off, but Cole watched him disappear into the horizon. The weight of the conversation sat heavy in his chest. Domingo hadn't needed to say much, but what he did say was enough. Cole had already known, in the quietest part of his heart, that there was more to his connection with Rosalie than he had been willing to admit. It wasn't just about the work. It wasn't just about the land. It was about something deeper, something that had been building without either of them saying a word. But now, it felt like everything had been laid out in front of him. Domingo had called him out, and in doing so, he had forced Cole to face the truth of what he was doing and who Rosalie really was to him. As the sun began to dip below the ridge, casting long shadows over the ranch, Cole turned back to the fence. The nails in his hand felt heavier now. His thoughts were a tangle of things, half-formed questions, lingering doubts, and a growing understanding that he needed to be honest with himself and with Rosalie. Because if he didn't, he might lose everything. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. The land wasn't the only thing he needed to learn how to hold on to. The days stretched long, the sun setting slower than usual, casting the dusty landscape in hues of orange and gold. Cole Whitaker was still out there, working, mending, fixing the ranch that had once been his father's pride. The morning started early, with the sharp bite of the desert chill, and the evenings ended with the heavy weight of the day's labor. But through it all, Rosalie was still there, just as she had been from the start. Cole had expected her to leave after what Domingo had said. He had expected the weight of her father's warning to push her away. But Rosalie didn't go anywhere. Instead, she continued to work by his side, just as steady and determined as ever. Every time he saw her, she was either hammering nails into the fence, carrying buckets of water to the trough, or simply sitting quietly by the fire, her face lit by the soft glow of the lanterns. They didn't need words to understand each other. The work had begun to feel like more than just a task. It was a way of communicating, of sharing something deeper than the soil beneath their feet. They both carried scars from the past, wounds that ran deeper than just the rough calluses on their hands. But together, through the quiet moments spent mending the land, they started to rebuild something together, a foundation that was starting to feel like more than just a place to survive. It was a place where they could start again. As the weeks passed, Cole began to realize how much he had come to rely on Rosalie. She wasn't just a partner in work anymore. She was a partner in everything. He found himself drawn to her even in the silence, in the way she moved with the land, with the unspoken strength in her eyes. She didn't need to say much to make him understand. She simply did. And that was something he had never experienced before. One evening, after the sun had dipped behind the horizon and the last of the day's work had been done, Cole found himself sitting on the porch, staring out at the land. The wind had picked up, and the dry air cut through his shirt. He wiped the sweat from his brow and exhaled deeply, lost in thought. Rosalie was sitting beside him, her legs crossed, watching the stars that were beginning to appear in the sky. They had been sitting in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Cole had never been good at talking about his feelings, but he could feel something stirring in his chest. He couldn't keep pretending it wasn't there. He had buried it for so long, convinced that the land, the ranch, the work, those were the things that mattered. But now, with Rosalie beside him, he realized he had been wrong. "Rosalie," he started, his voice rough from the dust of the day. She turned her head slightly to look at him, her dark eyes steady and calm. "I've been thinking about what your father said." Rosalie didn't respond right away. Instead, she shifted slightly, turning toward him, her gaze never leaving his. The air was still and heavy, the only sound the rustle of the cottonwood trees in the distance. "I don't know what I'm doing, but I know I can't do it alone," he continued, his words stumbling out as if they had been waiting to escape for far too long. "I've spent so many years on this land, trying to hold on to something, but I've never really had someone to share it with. And I don't know if I'm ready for that, but I'm not ready to lose it either." Rosalie was quiet for a long moment. She didn't seem surprised, but there was something in her expression that made Cole feel like he had said more than just words. She understood. She had always understood. "I don't want to be saved, Cole," she said finally, her voice soft but firm. "I'm not looking for someone to fix what's broken in me. I'm looking for someone who'll stand beside me, who'll build something with me." Her words hit him harder than he had expected. It wasn't what he had wanted to hear. Not exactly, but it was what he needed to hear. Rosalie wasn't here to be rescued. She was here to build something, to create something real, and she wasn't going to settle for anything less. "We're not here to save each other," she continued, her voice steady. "We're here to build something together. That's what matters." There it was, the words that had been hiding in his heart, the truth he had been too afraid to face. Rosalie wasn't waiting for him to save her. She was waiting for him to be brave enough to admit what they had together. The quiet understanding, the shared labor, the moments spent side by side. They didn't need to save each other. They just needed to be together. Cole felt something stir in him, something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just the weight of the land or the need to survive. It was the realization that he had been given something more than he had ever expected. Something he had never even known he was looking for. Rosalie's words settled over him like a balm, soothing the restlessness he had carried for so long. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel so alone. "I don't know if I'm ready for everything you're asking, Rosalie," he said, his voice quieter now. "But I'm willing to try, to build something with you, together." Rosalie smiled then, the kind of smile that wasn't about happiness, but about understanding. She nodded, as if she had known all along that this was where they were meant to be. "Then let's start," she said, her voice warm but resolute. "Let's start by building something real, something we can both be proud of." The wind had begun to die down, and the stars were now scattered across the sky, each one burning bright like a promise in the vast desert night. For the first time in a long time, Cole felt like he was on the edge of something new, not just a future, but a chance to create something that would last. Not just with Rosalie, but with the land, with everything that had once seemed impossible. The fire that had burned in him for so long, the fear of being alone, the fear of failing. He realized it had all been just a barrier he had built for himself. And now, standing beside Rosalie, in the stillness of the desert night, he finally saw the path ahead. There was no more running, no more hiding. There was only the work, the land, and the future they would build together. And for the first time, Cole Whitaker felt ready to face it. The day Cole Whitaker decided to marry Rosalie Jimenez, he wasn't driven by a sense of duty or obligation. It wasn't about anything as simple as a promise, or a need to tie the loose ends of his life. No, it was deeper than that. He realized that it was Rosalie who had sparked something in him that had been buried for years, something that the land had almost snuffed out. They stood together in the wide, open desert, a place where the wind carried the weight of history, and every grain of sand had a story. The sun hung low, casting long shadows over the earth, the dry dust swirling in the warm evening breeze. The sky stretched above them in a never-ending expanse, like the vastness of the future they would build together. No grand ceremony, no crowd, just the two of them, standing alone under the endless sky, with nothing to hold them back but their own willingness to move forward. It wasn't a typical wedding, not by any stretch. No preacher, no flowers, no white dress or silver rings. There were just the stars overhead, the desert at their feet, and a promise, silent but stronger than any words could convey. Rosalie didn't need the frills. She didn't need to be swept away by some grand notion of what marriage should be. She just needed the truth, and that truth was simple. They were building something together. When they exchanged vows, there was no need for speeches, no need to explain themselves. They both knew. They had spent the past months building a life from scratch, fixing fences, mending roofs, hauling water, working the land. Through every nail hammered into wood, through every stone set in place, they had built something more than just a ranch. They had built a life that was theirs, a foundation that no one could take from them. Cole had never believed in fairy tales. He didn't believe that love was supposed to be some kind of magic that solved everything. But this was real. The dirt under his boots, the sweat in his eyes, the fire in his belly. This was life, and it was something worth fighting for. They weren't just building a home. They were building a future, one that would last, one that their children could inherit. In the months that followed, Rosalie and Cole settled into a rhythm that felt as natural as the rising and setting of the sun. They worked together like they had always done, side by side, each day bringing them closer, not just as a couple, but as partners in every sense of the word. It wasn't always easy. The land was still dry, the work still grueling. But each time they finished a task, whether it was fixing a fence or planting seeds in the garden, they did it together. And that was the difference. In the evenings, after the work was done and the stars had begun to dot the sky, they would sit on the porch, the wind cooling their sweat, and talk. Not about anything in particular, just about the future, about the day that was coming, and the work that needed to be done. Sometimes there were silences between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a quiet understanding that, after everything, they didn't need to fill the space with words. They had each other, and that was enough. It wasn't long before Rosalie's hands, once rough from the endless labor of survival, had begun to shape something new, something they could both be proud of. She tended to the garden with the same care she gave the land, coaxing it to give back the smallest signs of life. The goats she had brought with her started to thrive, their milk filling the pails, their kids growing stronger with each passing day. They didn't have much, but they had enough. And that was all they needed. One afternoon, Cole stood in the barn, looking at the wooden shelves Rosalie had built. They weren't perfect, not by any means, but they were hers, and they stood as a testament to the fact that she was no longer the girl who had come to the ranch in search of water. She was a woman who had built something with her own hands, with her own will. The shelves were sturdy, practical, and real. And Cole couldn't help but feel a swell of pride when he looked at them. Later that evening, as they sat down to eat their meal, beans and cornbread, simple but filling, Rosalie turned to him with a look in her eyes that he knew all too well. It was the same look she'd had when she first spoke to him about the future, when she told him they weren't here to save each other, but to build something together. "I think we're finally getting there," she said, her voice low but confident. "This place, it's starting to feel like home." Cole set down his fork and nodded, his gaze wandering to the window, where the last light of the day was fading into the horizon. The wind was still, the land was quiet, and for once, it felt like they were on solid ground. "I think so too," he said, his voice thick with the weight of the years that had come before. He reached across the table, his hand brushing against hers. "We've built something real, Rosalie. Not just a ranch, but something that'll last." She smiled then, a soft smile that didn't need words to explain it. It was the kind of smile that said everything, the kind that told him she knew they had done something that mattered. The land was still dry, the wind still harsh, but they were building something that no drought could take away. They had each other, and that was the foundation of everything. The next morning, the sun rose as it always did, casting its light across the wide expanse of land that stretched out before them. The air was cool, the dirt still soft from the dew, and for the first time in a long time, Cole felt the weight of the future on his shoulders in a way that didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a promise. Rosalie stood beside him as they watched the first rays of the sun spill across the horizon. The silence between them wasn't one of uncertainty. It wasn't the silence of two people unsure of what was to come. It was the silence of two people who had found what they were looking for. In each other, in the land, in the work they did with their hands. And in that silence, Cole realized that this was what he had been fighting for all along. Not just the land, but a life worth living. "We've got a lot of work ahead of us," he said, his voice steady, full of purpose. Rosalie turned to him, her eyes meeting his with that same quiet strength. "We always have," she replied, and together, side by side, they faced the future. Not as two people trying to survive, but as two people building something real, something lasting, with their hands, their hearts, and the land that had finally begun to give back.